Hello. One of the most interesting and imaginative writers of the 20th century was J.R.R. Tolkien. People read Tolkien for many reasons and enjoy him for many reasons. And of course lots of people have watched the films of The Lord of the Rings. With me is Dr Alison Milbank, and she's going to address the question of why study Tolkien as part of a theological education. Why study Tolkien as a theologian?
Well, you have to begin by saying, why study literature as a theologian? And for me, literature is a mode of writing that can do theological work. Tolkien may not seem the most obvious person to study in this regard because he deliberately left religious practice to a great degree out of his great epic, The Lord of the Rings. But in order to write a fantasy novel, you have in a sense to commit to metaphysics. You have to create a world. That world has to have a certain consistency. It has to have what we might call an ontology, what is being in that world, what is ethics in that world. And Tolkien is particularly interested in these metaphysical questions. He wrote a lecture, the Andrew Lang lecture on fairy stories, which is all about how, as a fantasy writer, you take the things of this world and you reconnect them in new forms to make something completely new. And in doing so, it may seem as if you've got the world completely under your control. But in fact, for Tolkien, this was to liberate things, trees, elves, water, so that we might see it. He says not to quarrel with the philosophers and see things as things in themselves, the noumena, in other words, that Kant talks about, but to see things as we were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. So his fictional writing is in the service of a kind of philosophical realism, a realism that says there is a world apart from the self, and we can connect with that world through a kind of loving knowledge and reading of a kind of otherness. And in that otherness, we find the real. And that's why I actually wrote a book called Chesterton and Tolkien as Theologians, The Fantasy of the Real, because the fantasy of his world doesn't take you to a never, never land. It takes you back to this world to see it in this realist way. So to begin with, he's terribly interested in metaphysics in that sense. Secondly, he's very interested in a theology of art. So he's an ideal way to approach aesthetics. In that same essay on fairy stories, he wanted to tell us that to write, to paint a picture, even to cook a meal, all sorts of activities have an artistic dimension. And in so doing, they form what he called sub-creation. That is a kind of secondary mode of creation, which is taking the world that God has made and making a form shine upon a matter, would be the Thomist aesthetic writer Maritain way of putting it. That in a sense, you can almost add to the creation through your artistic endeavors. And he then moves from that to talk about the gospel itself as a kind of fairy story. By that he doesn't mean it's not true, but that it has the kind of shape of a fairy story. And in a sense, fairy stories are types of the true gospel, which is the true fairy story, where all that we would wish about the world can come true. And in that way, he felt people who wrote fantasy were, in a sense, performing a kind of subcreation. It's quite close, I suppose, to the theology of Nicholas of Cusa, that great late medieval cardinal who wrote on learned ignorance about how we are, in a sense, made as makers in the image of God. That was something that was terribly important for Catholic writers in the 1930s, such as Eric Gill and David Jones. They were all bothered about how you can make a kind of art that is theological in a way, even when it's not showing holy things. And Tolkien, in the same way, is not necessarily writing about holy things. He's writing about very ordinary things. But he wants to feel that they have an ethical component and that they link to the divine creation through their kind of radiance of form. In some senses, he is very Thomist, and I'm reaching to the theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas for many of the ways that I find it helpful to talk about Tolkien. And Thomas was, again, having a great renaissance in the Catholic world at the time, first of all among more dry scholastic readings of Thomas, but later more generous humanistic modes of reading him. And Tolkien belongs there, I suppose.
So you're seeing theology not as a body of doctrine which is then speculated upon in the way of almost as a law code is dealt with, but rather theology as a way of imagining, and the quality of one's imagination is the quality of one's theology. How adequate a world can you imagine so that you can actually understand the world which is more than the senses?
Yes, imagination and reason go together in the sense that you need imagination to reason. To actually, you use imagination in a kind of scientific experiment. You have to imagine what you're going to find. It's a kind of hermeneutic circle in order to speculate the way of going about to find it. And imagination is a form of discovery. Now, obviously, you're always discovering what is true. It's not a kind of sort of enlightenment reduction of the imagination and separating it from reason, which is why I'm using Thomas all the time. But it is a mode of imaginative discovery of that which is beyond. It is almost a kind of mystic kind of writing, whereby you want to so imagine things that they exceed your ability to describe them. And when people read about them, they have this kind of depth. And I think this is what readers find in Tolkien. Readers who are not religious always find it very sustaining because you can always go deeper and deeper and deeper. He imagined languages, he imagined geography, history, literatures, different cultures, anthropology, different economic systems. And that gives it a kind of depth, but it isn't an exhaustible depth. So everything that you read is both distant from you, so that it is not you, it's not just part of your perceptual world. There is an act of knowledge required and imagination to understand it. And the deeper and deeper you enter that imaginative world, the further and further it leads you on, and the stranger it makes your own world seem. So what Tolkien felt would happen would be that you would read about, I don't know, hobbits with hairy feet or golden apples in a fairy story, and this would restore the world to you as a created thing. So you're aware of its created nature, and it's imagination that leads you there, but it's leading you to a kind of theological truth that could be captured in another way through a systematic theology. But it's a very, very different way of doing it. It's almost a kind of performative exercise where you perform theology. And that's to take you back to a much more ancient idea of theology in the early church fathers, with your own expertise, where theology is a much more of a journey into the mystery of God.
Yes, I was actually thinking how, as you were speaking, I was thinking of how a writer that I've worked on from the late 7th century, he writes a description of the holy places. And actually, we tend to treat it as some sort of tourist book, because the nearest we have would be some sort of guide to Jerusalem. Jerry Murphy O'Connor's written a wonderful one, and we tend to sort of see it as a sort of a primitive version of that. And actually, if you try to read that, you don't understand, number one, why he records what he does record, and number two, why, since he'd never been to Jerusalem, he bothered to do it at all. It was the act, it was an act of theological imagination. He was saying, his literary form was not a novel. His literary form was what looks like a tourist guide, but he wanted to take you through this literary experience to seeing what he saw as most precious. So he wants to take you to places of prophecy. He then wants to take you to places of the birth, then the places of the Christ's life, and then finally the place where the Christ is still present. So it's actually Tolkien is using the great fairy story. He's using a far simpler thing. It looks like a travelogue, but actually it's a work of literary imagination, and as a work of literary imagination, it's bringing you into the world where all is to be. In knowing where the holy places are, you can locate where your own kitchen, your own fields, your own monastery, your own little local church. In fact, you can find out where your river, lake, whatever it is, it takes on a new place because it's been brought into this geographical relationship with what is more real. And like, he's fascinated by the idea, here is the very spot where such and such stood. Like, for instance, he has, this is the very stone on which Stephen is stoned. Now, he knows that there's all sorts of problems with that, but you're not supposed to get involved in that.
No.
It's a bit like asking, how can a hobbit have hairy legs or hairy feet? In this act of literary imagination, you are to relate yourself to the fact that the saints are still with you. And if you know where the great saints are buried, then you can actually understand your own graveyard, for instance.
Which is like pilgrimage itself, that pilgrimage is not about going to a holy place. It's not complete until you come back. And the holiness of that place is related to your own. We can think of that in literary terms as what the formalist critic Shlonsky at the beginning of the 20th century called estrangement, where you make language strange. You take you on a journey away from the familiar in order to block your access to it almost. So we think of language as transparent. You block access to it. And in so doing, it's revealed to you. What is revealed to you is then brought back into your own familiar world. But now your familiar world has this kind of halo of a kind of holiness.
I'd love to go back to something you said at the beginning. You made the point that in the world Tolkien creates in the imagination, there's so little place for formal religious practice. And I actually wonder, is that because it is so easy to reduce religion to religiosity and religious things and the formal things that we package with religion? And actually part of making the universe seem strange so that you can actually come to a new grasp of it, you actually have to remove the sort of easy escape hatch of thinking, oh, here is religion, because religion cannot be tied down to the formal acts of religion, but the religiosity has to actually permeate the whole of the reality.
I think that's true. I mean, he did think he was writing a form of pagan scripture, in a way, a kind of pagan equivalent to the Old Testament, which makes Christianity good to think. But you're absolutely right. He doesn't want Christianity to be a little holy area. He doesn't want you even to read Frodo the Hobbit as a Christ figure, because in fact he isn't at the very point when he's supposed to get rid of the ring of power and drop it back into Mount Doom. He can't do it. He can't perform a redemptive act. It's almost as if you need Christ in the future. But you're absolutely right. For Tolkien, everything is permeated with the presence of God, and there is a sense in which the whole of the world of The Lord of the Rings, it takes you into an enchanted world where rope, for example, is not just rope, it can untie itself. But in a sense, if we lived in a totally religious universe, rope would have that capacity, because there wouldn't be this alienation from the world. There wouldn't be this world of subject and object, but everything would be a you, as W.H. Auden writes in For the Time Being. Everything has presence. And the magic in his world is not really magic, it is a form of art, or a form of what the German philosopher Novalis called magic idealism, whereby everything becomes poetic. Every single object is beautiful and useful and has agency,
And
even
of course,
the trees.
And of course, the other thing is, like, I was referring to this description of the holy places by a man called Adamnan, but Tolkien's day job was working as an Anglo-Saxonist. And there is one way of reading Beowulf as the need for a people to create for itself the equivalent of an Old Testament. And so there is actually, at the very beginning of English literature in Beowulf, almost the paradigm, but the Beowulf author wants to imagine a past that leads to a very particular Christian present. So in a way, actually, Tolkien is reviving that sort of great story.
Definitely. Of course, he wrote a famous essay on Beowulf. And I think it's precisely to be seen in that way. This is a text which mentions monsters as children of Cain, but also puts it in a pagan world, as if you precipitate back a paganism that is heroic, where people are making acts of self-sacrifice, that does make a kind of pagan scripture. And I think Tolkien is absolutely fascinated by that. He actually pointed to the origin of his interest in Middle-earth as reading the Anglo-Saxon poem Christ, where there's a line about Earendil, which is probably a reference to a kind of morning star, John the Baptist, forerunner of Christ in some way. But he tried to imagine what was Earendil, and that word took him back, and he imagined a whole series of stories with a character with that name who does end up taking a Silmaril back to Vala and ends up in the sky, as if to kind of imagine a past that would be a kind of pagan scripture for Christianity. He said, I want to invent a mythology for England. And I think that's precisely what he's doing, is making this kind of pagan scripture like Snorri Sturluson in the Poetic Edda, with the Icelandic and Norse.
Oh yes,
myths.
and of course in the Edda material, and like in the prose Edda, they actually come out and say it quite openly. This is what we're doing. Like that's where you can sort of hear the academic speaking directly to the audience. Just in case you don't realize it, this is to show that grace was operative and was preparing a way that would lead us so that we would actually find. We would find actually that Christianity is not alien to us, but is actually the fulfillment.
Yes, precisely. And I think it's no accident that he was an Anglo-Saxon specialist, and one also a philologist. So he'll very often trace it through words and does lots of little cunning tricks with the words to give them a fullness of presence and to fill little gaps.
So you're reading Tolkien, you're reading him as an example of this creating a mythology to enact as an Old Testament, but you're also reading him in this much larger sense that all literature can be an engagement with theological questions, and literature can actually be a paradigm for theology.
In a way, yes. One might say that the story, the narrative, is the most basic religious literary form anyway. That literature is performative in the way that theology is performative. Literature invokes a universe, it invokes the meaning. you can't really commit to literature without some idea of meaning. Even if you write a really postmodern text, you're presupposing in the reader certain hermeneutic capacities to make sense even of the most dislocated text. And to commit to meaning is already a kind of basically religious act, which is seeking for truth.
On that note, Alison, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.